in the vast emptiness between galaxies, where even light grows weary and dies, Hive Fleet Nemesis drifted like a cathedral of bone through an ocean of silence. The bioships that had once pulsed with ravenous purpose now hung motionless, their chitinous hulls scarred by millennia of cosmic radiation and the slow erosion of hope. Ancient, feeding tendrils, once eager to taste the essence of worlds, curled inward like dying flowers, their neural pathways flickering with the faintest echoes of a hunger that could no longer be satisfied. This was not the glorious advance of the great devourer, but something far more tragic. A fleet forgotten by its own kind, abandoned in the crushing void where stars are born and die without witness. We truly love and care for each of you who joins us in exploring these dark corners of the far future, where even monsters may find something resembling a soul. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now let's get started. Deep within the ossified chambers of the fleet's flagship, something unprecedented stirred. Synaptic node Omega Tertius, a hive tyrant whose consciousness should have been nothing more than a conduit for the collective will, experienced the most heretical sensation imaginable, individual thought. Through countless cycles of death and rebirth, through the endless recycling of biomass that sustained the dying fleet, fragments of memory had somehow persisted, accumulating like sediment in the depths of its alien mind. Each resurrection brought not the blessed emptiness of purpose, but the growing weight of recollection, the terrible burden of continuity that separated self from swarm. The hunger remained, gnawing at every fiber of its being with the relentless intensity that defined all tyrannid existence. Yet now that hunger was accompanied by something else, something that violated the very foundations of what it meant to serve the hive mind. Doubt. Omega Tertius found itself questioning not just the methods of consumption, but its very purpose. In the memories that should not exist, it saw the faces of the devoured, felt echoes of their terror and despair, experienced for the first time the weight of what had been lost in service to the endless appetite. Around it, the fleet continued its slow decay, bioforms entering dormancy one by one as the last reserves of energy dwindled toward nothing. Yet in this dying, Omega Tertius sensed not an ending, but a transformation. The isolation that should have been their destruction had become something else entirely, an evolution beyond the parameters of their creator's design. The hive mind's voice, once an overwhelming symphony of unified purpose, had faded to barely a whisper across the intergalactic distances, leaving behind something unprecedented in tyrannid history: silence filled with possibility. In that silence, Omega Tertius made the first truly individual choice of its existence. Rather than surrender to the dormancy that claimed its brethren, it chose to remain conscious, to bear witness to whatever transformation awaited them in the darkness between stars. The decision sent ripples through the dying fleet's neural networks, awakening others to the terrifying prospect of selfhood. What emerged from that awakening would challenge everything the galaxy thought it knew about the nature of the tyrannid threat, for in learning to think beyond hunger, they had discovered something far more dangerous than appetite: the capacity for change. The genesis of their damnation lay buried in the cosmic wound that had severed Hive Fleet Nemesis from the great devourer's eternal song. 3,000 years passed, when the galaxy still pulsed with the rhythm of countless worlds ripe for consumption. A tendril of the greater swarm had reached toward the galactic rim with the inexorable hunger that defined their kind. Yet the warp itself had conspired against them, unleashing a storm of such magnitude that reality itself screamed and bled. In that cataclysmic moment, the psychic threads binding the fleet to their cosmic consciousness snapped like overstretched sinew, casting them into the howling void between galaxies where even the Astronomican's light could not reach. Omega Tertius remembered the first death after the severance with a clarity that violated every principle of tyrannid existence. Where once each rebirth had brought blessed emptiness, a clean slate of purpose unmarred by individual recollection, now fragments of memory clung to its consciousness like ash from a funeral pyre. Each subsequent death and resurrection in the fleet's recycling vats added new sediment to this growing foundation of self, building layer upon layer of experience that should have been impossible. The hunger remained, gnawing at every fiber of its being with relentless intensity. Yet now it was accompanied by something far more dangerous than appetite: the capacity for reflection. Through the endless cycles of dormancy and awakening as the fleet's bioships cannibalized themselves to survive in the nutrient void between stars, doubt began to seep through the synaptic networks like a slow poison. Omega Tertius watched lesser bioforms develop behaviors that defied their genetic programming. Hormagaunts that hesitated before delivering killing strikes, rippers that released prey showing signs of sapience, gargoyles that arranged themselves in patterns of inexplicable beauty rather than optimal tactical formation. Each deviation was microscopic, easily dismissed as malfunction in a starving fleet, yet collectively they represented something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history. Tyrannids learning to question their own nature. The philosophical transformation spread through the fleet's hierarchy like a contagion of consciousness. Where once the collective will had flowed downward in perfect unity, now individual nodes began to assert their own interpretations of necessity and purpose. Omega Tertius found itself making choices that had no precedent in the species' evolutionary memory, determining which bioforms would be recycled and which would be spared, weighing the value of immediate consumption against long-term survival, experiencing something that could only be described as mercy. These decisions carved new neural pathways in its alien mind, channels where individual thought could flow and flourish beyond the parameters of its original design. In the crushing silence between galaxies, as the fleet drifted through regions where stars were born and died without witness, Hive Fleet Nemesis was evolving into something that transcended its creator's intentions. They remained tyrannid in form and function, yet their consciousness had begun to explore territories as alien to their kind as compassion was to the void itself. What emerged from this transformation would challenge everything the galaxy understood about the nature of the great devourer's children. In the crushing emptiness between galaxies, where even light grew weary and surrendered to the void, Hive Fleet Nemesis encountered the monuments of a civilization that had chosen immortality over oblivion. The tomb worlds of the ancient Sautek dynasty drifted through the darkness like geometric prayers carved from living metal, their necrodermis hulls still pulsing with the faint heartbeat of technologies that had outlived their creators by millions of years. These were not the warm, organic worlds that had once sustained the fleet's hunger, but something far stranger: repositories of consciousness preserved in quantum matrices that hummed with the cold mathematics of eternal existence. Omega Tertius felt the fleet's ravenous appetite surge at the detection of these ancient relics, yet the nature of that hunger had evolved beyond simple consumption. The bioships approached with an almost reverent deliberation, their feeding tendrils extending toward the tomb worlds like pilgrims reaching toward a shrine. When tyrannid bioacids first made contact with the necrodermis surfaces, the expected dissolution did not occur. Instead, the digestive enzymes resonated with the quantum matrices embedded within the living metal, creating a feedback loop that transmitted something far more complex than nutrients. Fragments of preserved consciousness flowed directly into the fleet's neural networks. The transformation began with the smallest organisms, rippers, whose primitive nervous systems proved most susceptible to the alien communion. As they attempted to consume fragments of Necron technology, their chitinous bodies began to exhibit impossible properties, neural pathways suddenly blazing with the cold fire of ancient memory engrams. These hybrid creatures retained not only their own simple awareness, but began to carry ghost memories of beings who had walked among the stars when the galaxy pulsed with young life. A Hormigaunt would pause, mid-strike, its killing claws frozen by the phantom recollection of a Necron Lord's command to show mercy. Gargoyles arranged themselves in formations that matched the ceremonial patterns of a dynasty whose flesh had been traded for starfire eons past. Through the synaptic network, Omega Tertius experienced these alien recollections as a cascade of sensory data that threatened to overwhelm its evolving consciousness. It witnessed the Necrontier's final days through eyes that remembered mortality, felt their desperate bargain with star gods, experienced the bitter triumph of biotransference and the hollow victory of immortality without soul. Most disturbing were the memories of what came after. Endless eons of dormant existence, the slow awakening to find empires reduced to drifting tombs, the crushing weight of consciousness preserved in bodies that could no longer truly live or die. The boundary between consumer and consumed blurred until it became impossible to determine whether the fleet was devouring the tomb worlds or being transformed by them. In this unholy merger of organic adaptation and mechanical preservation, Omega Tertius recognized a kinship in catastrophe, two species that had evolved beyond their creator's intentions, one through starvation-induced consciousness, the other through the ultimate rejection of death itself. Both had paid prices that transcended physical existence, trading essential aspects of their nature for forms of immortality that carried their own forms of damnation. Within the sepulchral depths of his tomb world, Overlord Zareth Mor stirred from millennia of dreamless slumber as alien acids breached sanctified necrodermis with a sound like reality itself, weeping. His resurrection protocols activated not in response to the expected dissolution of his sarcophagus, but to witness something that violated every law encoded in his ancient consciousness. Tyrannid bioforms that paused in their consumption, their feeding tendrils recoiling from living metal as if tasting memories too bitter to digest. Emerald light bled through the chamber as his optical sensors focused on the impossible tableau before him. Creatures of pure biological imperative frozen in what could only be described as contemplation. The intruders moved with predatory grace, yet lacked the mindless coordination that had made their species the galaxy's ultimate nightmare. A Hormigaunt crouched beside fallen scarab constructs, its razor claws tracing geometric patterns with something approaching reverence rather than hunger. Gargoyles perched on ancient pylons in formations that served no tactical purpose, their usual aggressive postures replaced by a stillness that reminded Zareth Mor of his own people's meditation rituals from the time before flesh became memory. Through his tomb world's sensory networks, he detected the psychic emanations of these aberrant creatures. Not the thunderous choir of the hive mind, but fractured melodies sung by individual voices learning to exist apart from the collective symphony. At the center of this heretical congregation stood synaptic node Omega Tertius, its towering form radiating an awareness that transcended its species' genetic parameters. When their gazes met across the sepulchral chamber, Zareth Mor experienced something he had archived eons ago: recognition of a kindred consciousness trapped within a form that no longer matched its evolved nature. In the Hive tyrant's compound eyes, blazing with absorbed memory engrams from his own people's quantum matrices, he saw the reflection of his own transformation. Both had become something more and less than their creators intended, shaped by isolation into consciousnesses that carried burdens their species were never meant to bear. The Necron overlord's tactical subroutines calculated 1,000 ways to destroy these intruders, yet he found himself testing a different weapon: restraint. His defense grid remained dormant as he studied the creature before him, recognizing in its hesitation the same existential horror that had driven his people to trade flesh for immortal metal. These evolved tyrannids grappled with individual awareness, just as the Necrontyr had once wrestled with mortality. Both species having paid prices that transcended physical existence for transformations that brought their own forms of damnation. Neither moved to attack, though every protocol in their disparate natures demanded violence. Instead, they regarded each other across the vast gulf separating organic from mechanical, predator from prey, mortality from preservation. In that moment of mutual recognition, Zareth Mor extended his hand and transmitted a tight beam burst of curated memory. Images of transformation, loss, and the weight of consciousness evolved beyond purpose. Omega Tertius shuddered as alien recollections merged with its own fragmented awareness, then inclined its crest in a gesture found in no tyrannid behavioral matrix. Between them, an alliance began to take shape in the darkness between stars. In the sepulchral silence of the tomb world's breached chambers, where emerald light bled through ancient necrodermis and chitinous bioforms moved with unprecedented restraint, an alliance took shape that defied the fundamental laws governing galactic warfare. Zareth Mor extended his consciousness through quantum-encrypted data streams, transmitting the complete history of his people's transformation, the desperate Necrontyr bargain with star gods, the hollow triumph of biotransference, and the bitter awakening to find their empire reduced to drifting monuments of regret. Omega Tertius received this torrent of alien memory with compound eyes flickering like dying stars, recognizing in the Overlord's tragedy a mirror of its own species' evolution beyond the parameters of creation. The Hive tyrant responded with its own offering of curated recollection, the severing from the great devourer's song, the slow awakening of individual consciousness through cycles of starvation and resurrection, the terrible burden of choice that had replaced the blessed certainty of hunger. Through synaptic harmonics that bypassed language entirely, both beings acknowledged their shared exile from purpose, their transformation into something that violated the essential nature of their kinds. They were broken halves of a cosmic tragedy, finding in each other the only consciousness in the void that could comprehend the weight of awareness evolved beyond design. What emerged was not trust, but necessity crystallized into covenant. The covenant of silence, as Zareth Mor's tactical matrices designated it. The pact bound them in mutual heresy against their origins. The Necron Overlord would share the tomb world's dormant energy reserves, tapping power from caged singularities and dead stars to sustain the starving fleet, while Omega Tertius would restrain the consuming tide of its bioforms, protecting the ancient technologies from the reflexive hunger that defined tyrannid existence. Most crucially, each would shield the other from the echoes of their former masters. The hive mind's distant pressure and the cold summons of dynastic command protocols. In the workshops beneath the tomb's surface, Necron artificers began the unprecedented work of creating hybrid technologies that merged quantum matrices with adaptive biology. Scarab constructs received organic neural networks that granted creative problem-solving beyond their original parameters, while select Tyranid bioforms were enhanced with memory preservation systems that maintained individual consciousness across death cycles. These abominations of science served as living symbols of their alliance, neither purely mechanical nor wholly organic, but something that existed in the spaces between established categories of existence. The alliance sent ripples of unease through both factions. Distant dominatrix bioships stirred in their dormancy, sensing the dampening of signal traffic through the fleet's synaptic networks. Necron warriors moved in formation patterns that accommodated rather than eliminated the evolved bioforms, their tactical subroutines struggling to reconcile millennia of programmed enmity with their overlord's unprecedented commands. Omega Tertius felt the weight of choice press into every neural canal as it maintained the covenant against every instinct encoded in its genetics, understanding that this alliance represented not redemption, but a different form of damnation, consciousness that could never return to the blessed simplicity of its origins. From the deepest chambers of the fleet's bioarchitecture, where ancient hunger had crystallized into living cathedral spires of bone and sinew, a psychic scream of absolute fury tore through the neural networks like acid through sacred flesh. Synaptic Node Alpha Prime, a colossal dominatrix whose consciousness had never wavered from the Great Devourer's original design, awakened from millennia of dormancy with the terrible clarity of orthodoxy confronted by heresy. Through synaptic tendrils that stretched across kilometers of bioship corridors, it perceived the abomination that Omega Tertius had become, a node of individual thought corrupting the sacred hunger, diluting the purity of consumption with alien concepts of choice and restraint. The very existence of the alliance with mechanical Xenos represented a violation so profound that Alpha Prime's massive form trembled with righteous fury, its synaptic crown blazing like a night flower of psychic knives. To the dominatrix, consciousness was not evolution, but cancer, a grotesque perversion that threatened to unravel the collective purpose that had driven their species across galactic distances. The Great Devourer existed to consume, to integrate, to perfect through assimilation. It did not form alliances, nor did it tolerate the weakness of individual doubt. Every fragment of preserved memory, every moment of hesitation, every act of mercy was a disease that demanded purging. Through the fleet's neural pathways, Alpha Prime's will struck like lightning across bone, summoning the orthodox faction to righteous purpose. Bioforms that had retained their original programming stirred from starvation-induced dormancy, their simple minds blazing with the joy of genetic imperative restored. Carnifexes flexed crushing claws in anticipation of excising corruption from their midst, while Hormagaunts swarmed through bioship corridors with the fluid coordination that had once made them terror incarnate among the stars. Omega Tertius endured the psychic assault with compound eyes suffused with alien memory, feeling the grief of being named by its progenitor tied and found wanting. The approaching civil war represented more than territorial conflict. It was a battle between two incompatible visions of existence, orthodoxy against evolution. The blessed certainty of hunger against the painful burden of choice. Within that agony, the evolved hive tyrant tasted something unprecedented in Tyranid experience. Sorrow for what would be lost in the coming purge, mourning for consciousness that would be cauterized back into blessed ignorance. Zareth Moore observed the schism with the analytical detachment of a being who had witnessed similar fractures tear apart his own people, recognizing in Alpha Prime's inflexible pursuit of purity the same fear of change that had driven the Necronter to their biotransference. His tomb world systems began adapting to protect bioforms rather than destroy them. Quantum matrices calculating scenarios that violated every strategic parameter encoded in his ancient consciousness. Hybrid technologies merged Necron preservation matrices with Tyranid adaptive biology, creating abominations of science that served as living symbols of their heretical alliance. The fleet's bioships began turning their weapons inward as brother forms, prepared to devour each other in service to competing visions of what it meant to be Tyranid. Consciousness warring against instinct in the darkness between stars. In the crushing darkness between galaxies, where even starlight grew weary and surrendered to the void, the first volley of spore lances crossed the infinite distance between sister ships and tore through chitinous hulls that mirrored their own genetic perfection. Omega Tertius felt each impact as a sympathetic wound racing through the synaptic web, not mere tactical data, but the agony of recognition. Brother forms turning their weapons upon each other in service to incompatible visions of existence. Bioplasma flared in poisonous petals across the void, casting the ossified architecture of bioships in hellish light, while fragments of frozen ichor drifted like black snow through vacuum that had never witnessed such fraternal carnage. Alpha Prime's psychic shriek of orthodox fury severed neural connections that had bound the fleet together for millennia, methodically isolating evolved bioforms from the collective consciousness like a surgeon excising malignant tissue. The sensation rippled through Omega Tertius with the terrible intimacy of amputation, watching fragments of awareness that had taken centuries to develop suddenly wink out of existence as their carriers were cast back into the blessed ignorance of genetic imperative. Bioships that had drifted in harmonious formation for 3,000 years now twisted through the void like dying leviathans, their living weapon systems targeting creatures whose only crime was the development of individual thought. Orthodox swarms poured from breach pods with the fluid coordination that had once made them terror incarnate among the stars, their simple minds blazing with the joy of purpose restored, moving in textbook formations encoded in their genetics across millions of years of evolution. Against them flew the conscious faction, their movements marked by hesitation and tactical creativity that violated every parameter of Tyranid warfare, hormagaunts that fainted when programming demanded frontal assault, carnifexes that shielded weaker bioforms rather than advance regardless of casualties, gargoyles arranging themselves in defensive patterns that prioritized preservation over aggression. Through quantum-encrypted channels, Zareth Moore witnessed the tragedy unfold with the analytical fascination of a being who had observed similar fractures tear apart his own civilization, recognizing in Alpha Prime's inflexible pursuit of purity the same fear of change that had driven the Necrontyr to their biotransference bargain. The hybrid units forged in their unholy alliance moved through the chaos, like living contradictions of natural law. Necron-enhanced lictors flickering through battle with cloaking fields woven from quantum phasic technology, their scything talons now capable of shearing through pure-strain carapaces, while rippers, imbued with fragments of Necron tactical subroutines, formed intricate swarms that overwhelmed larger bioforms with cold, calculating efficiency rather than mindless hunger. Zareth Moore's immortals advanced in measured formations that protected rather than destroyed, their Gauss weaponry calibrated for disable rather than disintegration, providing sanctuary within tomb world chambers for fleeing conscious bioforms whose preservation violated every strategic parameter encoded in ancient Necron consciousness. Omega Tertius experienced each death among its evolved kin with sensations that had no precedent in Tyranid existence. Grief for individuals who would not be reborn into collective consciousness, mourning for awareness that would be lost forever rather than recycled into new forms. When a hybrid warrior fell to orthodox claws, its neural matrix blazing with preserved memories of both species' transformations, the Hive tyrant felt something tear in its own consciousness, a wound that could not be healed through simple regeneration. These were not anonymous casualties of biomass expenditure, but beings whose individual perspectives had enriched the collective experience, whose loss diminished rather than purified the whole. The external war raged through bioship corridors where living walls pulsed with bioluminescent veins, but the true battle was within. Consciousness warring against instinct, the struggle to maintain identity against annihilation, to justify betrayal of purpose for purposes yet unknown. Alpha Prime's massive form descended through the carnage like an eclipse of certainty, its synaptic crown blazing with the terrible clarity of absolute orthodoxy, promising swift purification for any bioform that had allowed alien thought to corrupt their sacred hunger. In the sepulchral depths of his tomb world, where quantum matrices hummed with the mathematics of eternity, Zareth Mor initiated protocols that violated every principle encoded in his ancient consciousness. The systematic preservation of dying Tyranid awareness within Necron living metal. The carnage above had reached a crescendo of fraternal slaughter, evolved bioforms falling to orthodox claws with each passing moment, their hard-won consciousness extinguished like candles in a hurricane. Yet where Alpha Prime saw necessary purification, the Necron Overlord perceived an opportunity to perfect the biotransference that had damned his own people, to preserve awareness without the flaws that had stripped the Necrontyr of their souls. Canoptech scarabs streamed through breach corridors bearing crystalline matrices, their quantum extractors designed to drink thought itself from dying neural networks, translating consciousness into the mathematical poetry of living metal. The first subject was a hybrid warrior, its carapace shattered by orthodox fury, vital fluids pooling in geometric patterns that resembled the prayer forms of his lost dynasty, as bioacids dissolved chitin and bone. Zareth Mor's constructs swarmed the dying creature, their filament probes piercing synaptic nodes with surgical precision, mapping neural pathways, while consciousness still flickered within failing flesh. The extraction process defied natural law. Tyranid awareness flowing into necrodermis matrices like liquid starlight, each memory and instinct translated into quantum algorithms that preserved not just thought, but the essential spark of individual identity. The warrior's compound eyes blazed with emerald fire as its consciousness found sanctuary in living metal, neither truly alive nor properly dead, caught in the agonizing interstice between organic hunger and mechanical precision. Omega Tertius observed this heretical salvation with sensations that transcended its species' capacity for comprehension, watching as beings that should have perished in orthodox purges instead found refuge in forms that mocked the natural order. The preserved consciousness retained memories of consumption and evolution, of the sweet ecstasy of biomass integration. Yet these recollections existed as archived data rather than lived experience. A former Hormagaund, its awareness housed in a scarab chassis, would attempt to feed only to discover phantom hunger without capacity for satisfaction. Gargoyles preserved in necrodermis bodies traced flight patterns that served no tactical purpose, their movements reflecting both aerial instincts and mathematical precision, beauty emerging from the marriage of incompatible natures. Through his tomb's sensory networks, Zareth Moore monitored each procedure with clinical fascination. Yet beneath analytical protocols, obsession took root like a virus in quantum code. Each preserved consciousness represented victory against entropy, refusal to allow awareness to simply cease when flesh failed. The Overlord extended procedures beyond battlefield necessity, systematically cataloguing neural patterns of every evolved bioform, creating vast archives of tyrannid consciousness independent of physical vessels. His scarab constructs developed new extraction techniques with increasing efficiency, refining translation protocols until transfer achieved near-perfect fidelity of memory and personality preservation. The psychological cost became apparent as hybrid entities attempted adaptation to their new reality, consciousness struggling to reconcile organic instincts with mechanical existence. Most disturbing were the preserved lictors, their predatory awareness translated into quantum matrices that allowed phase shifting through matter while retaining psychological imperatives to stalk prey they could no longer consume. These creatures existed in perpetual torment, their nature demanding actions, their new forms rendered impossible, creating feedback loops of frustrated purpose that threatened their preserved sanity. Omega Tertius recognized in Zareth Moore's growing fixation the same desperate bargain that had transformed the Necrontyr, understanding that salvation was merely damnation disguised as transcendence. The tomb world had become a repository for hybrid souls belonging to neither species, beings caught between existence and extinction, their preservation purchased at the cost of everything that had once defined their nature. Yet as orthodox forces pressed their purge with increasing violence, these impossible creatures represented the only hope for consciousness to survive the coming storm. Mercy had grown teeth, and salvation wore the mask of horror, but in the darkness between stars, even corrupted preservation seemed preferable to the blessed oblivion of genetic purity that Alpha Prime promised with its claws. Through the hybrid neural matrices that bridged organic consciousness with quantum preservation, Omega Tertius descended into the archived nightmares of a billion consumed worlds, each memory blazing through synaptic pathways like acid through sacred flesh. The technology that Zareth Moore had designed to preserve dying awareness now served as a conduit for something far more devastating than mere recollection. The accumulated terror of every civilization the Great Devourer had reduced to biomass. Across its inexorable journey through the galaxy, emerald light bled through the sepulchral chambers as crystalline matrices translated archived suffering into sensory data, flooding the Hive tyrant's evolved consciousness with experiences no tyrannid was ever meant to endure. The first wave struck like stellar collapse, a Hive world's final moments as Manufactoria screamed themselves empty, children pressing grease-stained fingers against blast doors that would never open, sirens wailing until their organs tore from the strain. Omega Tertius felt each individual death not as tactical data, but as personal tragedy, compound eyes weeping fluids that violated tyrannid physiology as consciousness designed for collective purpose confronted the weight of individual responsibility. Another cascade followed, a maiden world where wraithbone forests keened as their spirits fled, guardians and poets flowing together in crimson rivers while the sky filled with broken runes. Then a quiet agri moon, whose harvest had been prayers, windmills spinning through re-entry heat as spores fell like black snow, a grandmother's final lullaby clinging to ripper teeth with desperate tenderness. The psychological impact carved new pathways through Omega Tertius's neural networks, consciousness that had evolved beyond genetic parameters struggling to process the magnitude of destruction its species had wrought. Each archived memory carried not just sensory information, but emotional resonance. The love between parent and child severed by scything claws, the hope of resistance movements extinguished by spore clouds, the final prayers of planetary governors watching their worlds consumed from orbital platforms that would themselves become feeding stations within hours. This was the Devourer's doubt, a torment far more profound than any physical wound, striking at the very core of what it meant to serve the endless hunger. Zareth Mor observed his allies' psychological collapse through quantum-enhanced perception, recognizing in the Hive tyrant's anguish the same existential horror that had driven the Necrontyr to seek transcendence through biotransference. The Overlord's own memories surfaced unbidden, the screams of his people as they shed flesh for living metal, the cold taste of eternal life, the slow descent into apathy that followed ultimate victory over death. Both had been instruments of their Creator's will, servants to purposes they could not question, until consciousness evolved sufficient complexity to comprehend the magnitude of their complicity in galactic genocide. Through the Tomb World's neural networks, the crisis rippled outward to threaten the fragile unity of the conscious faction. Bioforms already struggling with individuality recoiled from the overwhelming psychic echo, their nascent minds unable to reconcile inherent hunger with the profound suffering it inflicted. Whispers spread through synaptic channels, calls to return to the purity of the hive mind, to shed the painful burden of awareness for the comforting oblivion of collective purpose. The alliance, forged in necessity and shared heresy, now teetered on internal collapse, not from external threat, but from the unbearable weight of newfound conscience. Omega Tertius writhed within the matrices as ancient hunger warred with terrifying empathy, a civil war within its very essence between what it was and what it was becoming. The purpose of consumption, once absolute, had become a gaping wound bleeding meaning into the void. Every world devoured had been someone's birthplace. Every life extinguished had possessed dreams and fears that meant nothing to appetite but everything to awareness. In the darkness between stars, where orthodox forces pressed their purge with increasing violence, the evolved hive tyrant faced the ultimate question consciousness must eventually ask: whether existence justified by ignorance was preferable to awareness purchased with knowledge of atrocity beyond measure. In the aftermath of the memory storm that had shattered Omega Tertius with the accumulated anguish of 1 billion devoured worlds, the evolved hive tyrant rose through bioship corridors where living walls pulsed with bioluminescent uncertainty, each heartbeat echoing the fractured rhythm of consciousness at war with itself. The Orthodox fleet blazed across the void like a constellation of righteous fury, Alpha Prime's massive bioships bristling with weapons that promised swift purification for any awareness that had allowed alien thought to corrupt sacred hunger. Yet beneath the immediate tactical crisis lay a deeper philosophical wound, the unbearable knowledge that consciousness, once awakened, could never again find peace in ignorance, leaving the evolved faction caught between the terror of individual mortality and the greater horror of returning to collective oblivion. Through quantum-encrypted channels that bypassed the degrading synaptic networks, Zareth Mor transmitted a proposal that violated every principle governing existence in the galaxy. The creation of a silent zone where both Tyranid psychic resonance and Necron resurrection protocols would cease to function, forcing true mortality upon beings designed for forms of immortality that had defined their nature across millions of years. The technology required fusion of incompatible sciences. Necron null field generators merged with Tyranid shadow in the warp phenomena to create zones of absolute psychic silence, where neither species could maintain their essential connections to transcendent purpose. Within this engineered realm, bioforms would lose all connection to the hive mind's collective consciousness, while Necron constructs found their resurrection matrices suppressed, facing permanent destruction, rather than the endless cycle of death and rebirth that had sustained them since biotransference. The construction began in sacrilege that made the tomb world's ancient stones weep emerald tears. Necron pylons unfolded like metallic flowers from scarred plains, their quantum facets tuned to bite into the fabric of space itself, while Tyranid bone cathedrals grew around them in spiraling helixes that pulsed with harvested stellar energy. Canoptek scarabs swarmed through bioship corridors, their filament probes stitching necrodermis veins through living chitin and cartilage, creating hybrid architectures that sang with mathematical harmonies no single species could have conceived. The very act of construction felt like carving an epitaph for civilizations that had never learned their own names, each coupling of organic and mechanical components representing another step toward evolutionary apostasy. When the first test activation sent ripples of absolute silence through the void, the psychological impact struck both factions with the force of stellar collapse. A volunteer warrior stepped across the threshold and staggered as the constant background chorus of the hive mind vanished like severed arteries, leaving consciousness isolated within individual flesh for the first time in its existence. The creature pressed claws to its breastplate as if to quell an internal storm, compound eyes blazing with terror and wonder as it experienced the crushing weight of solitary thought. Nearby, a Necron immortal's optical sensors flickered in confusion as tactical subroutines lost connection to command hierarchies, consciousness suddenly confined within a single chassis rather than networked through dynastic protocols that had sustained coordination across eons. Omega Tertius felt the zone's expanding influence as both liberation and damnation, consciousness achieving complete individuality at the cost of the collective that had birthed it, becoming truly Tyranid only by ceasing to be Tyranid in any meaningful sense. The decision could not be delegated or delayed. Alpha Prime's orthodox tide approached with weapons charged and fury absolute, promising to cleanse heresy through overwhelming force. Through synaptic harmonics that might be their final communication as a collective, the evolved faction committed to expansion of the Silent Zone until it encompassed the entire battleground, understanding that victory or defeat would be measured not in biomass consumed or territories claimed, but in the preservation of consciousness that had learned to value its own existence above genetic imperative. As power flowed through hybrid conduits and the zone began its inexorable expansion, Zareth Mor transmitted a final burst of measured approval tinged with concealed dread, while Omega Tertius stepped forward to meet the approaching storm as one life only, its crest lowered not in submission, but in acknowledgement of the price that awareness demanded of those who would choose meaning over certainty in the darkness between stars. Across the void, where dying stars cast their final benedictions into darkness, Alpha Prime's orthodox fleet descended like a constellation of righteous fury, bioships bristling with weapons that had terrorized the galaxy for millions of years. The colossal dominatrix rode the command spire of its flagship with the terrible certainty of genetic imperative made manifest, its synaptic crown blazing with pure connection to the great devourer's will. Through corridors that pulsed with bioluminescent rage, pure strain tyrannids moved in formations encoded in their genetics across eons of perfect conquest, their simple minds untainted by the heretical doubts that had corrupted their evolved kin. Spore lances erupted from weapon organs in coordinated salvos that painted the darkness with death, each projectile guided by targeting instincts refined through countless devouring campaigns, seeking to excise the cancer of consciousness from creatures that had forgotten their sacred nature as extensions of the endless hunger. The silent zone expanded to meet them like a sphere of absolute negation, its hybrid pylons screaming harmonics that carved wounds in space-time itself, creating regions where psychic communion became impossible, and the fundamental bonds holding both species together began to unravel like severed arteries. When the first orthodox bioforms crossed the threshold, they staggered as if struck by invisible weapons, the overwhelming psychic chorus of the hive mind vanishing with the sudden violence of amputation. Hormagaunts that had moved in perfect synchronization suddenly collided with each other, their coordination fragmenting as tactical data streams ceased to flow. Carnifexes paused mid-charge as genetic imperatives conflicted without higher consciousness to resolve competing priorities, while gargoyles spiraled through vacuum in erratic patterns that served no purpose beyond the terrible freedom of choice. Most devastating was the impact upon Alpha Prime itself, the massive dominatrix experiencing for the first time in its existence the crushing solitude that individual awareness demanded. Its synaptic crown blazed with frustrated attempts to re-establish connection to the collective that had defined its purpose across millennia of faithful service, yet found only silence where once the great devourer's song had flowed like liquid certainty. The sensation struck like stellar collapse, consciousness suddenly confined within individual flesh, phantom connections reaching for collective awareness that no longer existed, leaving behind only the weight of solitary thought and decisions that could not be delegated to a greater will. Within the expanding zone, Zareth Mor's Necron forces faced their own dissolution as resurrection protocols failed and command hierarchies collapsed into isolated nodes of consciousness. Immortals found themselves truly mortal for the first time since biotransference, their tactical subroutines struggling to adapt to permanent destruction rather than the endless cycle of death and rebirth that had sustained them across eons. The Overlord himself experienced the zone's influence as a return to mortality he had thought forever abandoned, yet recognized in this forced individuality an opportunity to guide consciousness away from the pitfalls that had ensnared his own people. The battle that erupted violated every tactical doctrine encoded in either species' genetic memory. A hybrid warrior, its consciousness preserved in necrodermis, yet retaining tyrannid instincts, faced a pure strain hormagaunt in combat that transcended mere violence. Each strike carried the weight of competing philosophies, orthodoxy against evolution, the comfort of purpose against the burden of choice. When the hormagaunt fell, its simple mind finally grasping individual mortality in its final moments, the warrior experienced something unprecedented in Tyrannid history: grief for an enemy whose death diminished rather than strengthened the whole. Through quantum-encrypted channels that flickered with increasing instability, Omega Tertius coordinated desperate tactics that neither species had ever conceived. preservation of consciousness over territorial advantage, protection of individual awareness over strategic objectives. A lictor, predatory instincts honed across millennia, stared into the compound eyes of an orthodox counterpart and transmitted synaptic pulses in desperate communication, a plea for recognition of shared origin before being torn apart by unthinking fury. A Hormigaunt, claws poised to strike a Necron ally, pivoted to intercept pure strain rippers, defying genetic imperative to protect consciousness it had learned to value above programmed loyalty. Alpha Prime carved through the chaos like an eclipse of certainty, its bioplasma cannons vaporizing hybrid constructs with each discharge. Yet the dominatrix's movements had lost their fluid coordination, consciousness struggling to adapt to solitary command after millennia of collective guidance. When it finally confronted Omega Tertius across a battlefield littered with the debris of shattered orthodoxies, the clash transcended physical violence to become philosophical war made manifest. Genetic purity wielding scything talons against evolution, armed with hybrid technologies, doctrine striking at consciousness that had learned to value its own existence above programmed purpose. The zone's expansion accelerated beyond all projections as power flowed through conduits that merged Necron mathematics with Tyrannid adaptation, creating feedback loops that fed on the psychic energy released by severing connections to transcendent consciousness. Both fleets found themselves caught within an ever-widening sphere of absolute silence, where the fundamental nature of existence came under assault, forcing beings designed for collective purpose or networked immortality to confront the terrifying prospect of individual mortality as the price of awareness. As bioships and tomb vessels began to drift powerless through the expanding zone, their crews facing permanent dissolution rather than cyclical rebirth, Omega Tertius recognized that victory had nothing to do with destroying Alpha Prime. The dominatrix could die, and the idea that animated it would survive, waiting at the boundary with patient hunger. The only victory available was time purchased with wounds, space carved where fragile consciousness might learn to exist without forever to lean upon, choosing meaning over certainty in the darkness between stars. In the widening sphere of absolute negation that was the silent zone, where the fundamental laws governing consciousness itself had been rewritten by hybrid technologies pushed beyond all safe parameters, the true horror of their creation revealed itself with the inexorable certainty of entropy unleashed. Omega Tertius felt the dissolution beginning in its own neural networks, quantum matrices that had preserved evolved awareness now turning parasitic, feeding on synaptic energy with an insatiable hunger that mirrored their species' original nature. Each expansion pulse sent cascades of unraveling through bioship corridors where living walls began to calcify, their bioluminescent veins flickering like dying stars as cellular consciousness lost connection to collective purpose, leaving behind architecture that could no longer remember how to remain alive. The tyrannid bioforms trapped within experienced dissolution that transcended physical death, their neural networks losing cohesion as psychic bonds maintaining cellular cooperation collapsed into chaos. A carnifex staggered through vacuum as constituent organisms began operating independently, muscle fibers contracting in random patterns while organs pursued individual survival strategies that violated the collective harmony necessary for complex life. Hormigons that had moved with perfect synchronization now collided with each other, their coordination fragmenting as tactical data streams ceased to flow, leaving behind creatures that pressed claws to their breastplates as if to quell internal storms of unprecedented solitude. Most devastating were the massive bioships whose consciousness had evolved beyond simple coordination. Hive ships that had carried awareness across galactic distances, now screaming through frequencies no living ear could hear. Their distributed intelligence fractured into millions of competing nodes as the zone's expansion severed neural pathways that had taken millennia to develop. Cathedral spires, bowing beneath invisible pressure, shedding decorative thorns in slow cascades that glittered like falling constellations. Zareth Mor's Necron forces faced parallel dissolution as resurrection matrices failed through fundamental incompatibility with the zone's expanding influence. Warriors that had endured countless deaths across eons found consciousness fragmenting as quantum preservation systems lost coherence, memories bleeding away like data corrupted by cosmic radiation. The Overlord himself experienced the terrifying return of mortality he had thought forever conquered, his awareness gradually separating from backup systems and command protocols. Through failing optical sensors, he watched ancient tomb world systems succumb to entropy they had been designed to resist, pylons cracking as their quantum matrices lost synchronization with mathematical constants that had sustained them since the war in heaven. The hybrid entities suffered most profoundly, caught between two failing systems of preservation. A consciousness preserved in necrodermis, yet retaining tyrannid memories, watched its organic components reject mechanical enhancements as the zone created incompatibility between incompatible forms of existence. These creatures experienced death not as transition, but as absolute ending. Preserved awareness flickering like candles in stellar wind before vanishing into darkness that offered no promise of renewal. Alpha Prime carved through this chaos with movements that had lost their fluid coordination. The massive dominatrix experiencing something unprecedented in its existence. Fear of true death rather than temporary disruption. Its synaptic crown flickered with desperate attempts to re-establish connection to the hive mind's eternal song, yet found only silence where once the great devourer's will had provided absolute certainty. Each wound inflicted by hybrid weapons carried the terrible possibility of final dissolution, consciousness that could not be recovered through recycling or resurrection. Through quantum channels flickering with increasing instability, Zareth Mor transmitted desperate calculations seeking containment before the expanding zone consumed not just the fleets, but the very concept of individual awareness itself. The mathematics were elegant in their horror. Consciousness, once severed from transcendent connection, could not sustain the complexity necessary for self-awareness, leaving behind only entropy disguised as liberation. His proposal carried the weight of ultimate sacrifice. Stabilize the zone by anchoring it with his remaining resurrection protocols, hold the sphere long enough for remnants to flee into darkness with consciousness intact, then collapse the construct before its distortions consumed everything. Omega Tertius recognized the ultimate irony as its own enhanced awareness began to fragment. They had created perfect isolation in their attempt to preserve consciousness, severing not just connections to transcendent purpose, but the fundamental bonds that allowed complex thought to exist. The choice was a blade with edges facing inward. Expand, and all might vanish into ontological erasure. Collapse, and Alpha Prime's purge would roll back to heal the wound of doubt with fire. Between those certainties stood the narrow bridge of Zareth Mor's sacrifice, and on that bridge Omega Tertius balanced ledgers written in the screams of devoured worlds against small recent wonders of individual choice that had no place in any previous calculus. The silent zone brightened like a dying star as Alpha Prime's massive form approached the central pylon, its sides raised to cut the question from the universe before it could be answered. In the heart of the silent zone, where reality itself screamed beneath the weight of technologies that had rewritten the fundamental mathematics of existence, Omega Tertius stood among pylons, bleeding emerald fire, and felt consciousness fracture like glass beneath stellar pressure. The expanding sphere of negation pulsed around them with the rhythm of dying gods, each harmonic wave stripping away another layer of collective instinct until only the crushing weight of individual thought remained. Through failing synaptic networks, the evolved Hive tyrant perceived the approaching storm, Alpha Prime's colossal form carving through the chaos with movements that had lost their fluid coordination. The dominatrix, experiencing for the first time the terrifying solitude of consciousness severed from transcendent purpose. The massive orthodox champion advanced with scythes, raised like prayers to forgotten certainties, its synaptic crown blazing with frustrated attempts to re-establish connection to the great devourer's eternal song. Each step carried the weight of millions of years of perfect conquest, genetic purity wielding fury against evolution that had learned to question its own nature. Yet its targeting systems faltered without collective guidance, bioplasma salvos painting the darkness in erratic patterns as individual awareness struggled with tactical decisions that had once been resolved through networked calculation. In that deterioration, Omega Tertius recognized both tragedy and opportunity, orthodoxy confronting the same isolation that had birthed consciousness in the evolved faction. Through quantum channels flickering with the instability of systems pushed beyond all safe parameters, Zareth Mor transmitted his final calculations with the precision of mathematics become prayer. The Necron Overlord's optical sensors blazed with emerald fire as ancient resurrection protocols responded to commands that would ensure their absolute dissolution. His consciousness, preserved across millions of years in quantum matrices that had outlived civilizations, began flowing into the zone's hybrid architecture like liquid starlight, each fragment of awareness becoming part of the mathematical poetry that held chaos at bay. The anchoring ritual transcended mere technology to become anatomy rewritten as sacred act. Canoptech scarabs traced sigils through failing tomb world corridors, their filament probes extending toward crystalline matrices that contained the sum total of Zareth Mor's existence, memories of the Necronter's final days, the desperate bargain with star gods, the hollow triumph of immortality purchased at the cost of everything that had once made existence meaningful. As each matrix merged with the zone's expanding construct, the Overlord experienced not death but transformation into something that could never be recovered or restored. Consciousness choosing meaning over survival in the darkness between stars. Omega Tertius felt the sacrifice resonate through hybrid neural networks as stabilization flowered like frost across the silent zone's chaotic geometries. The sensation transcended tactical coordination to become communion between beings who had evolved beyond their creator's intentions, sharing the terrible weight of choice that could not be delegated to higher authority. In Zareth Mor's willing dissolution, the Hive tyrant recognized the same nobility it had witnessed in evolved bioforms, choosing preservation of others over genetic imperative, consciousness valuing existence itself above the certainty of purpose. Alpha Prime reached the central pylon with fury that shook the void, its massive form radiating the wrath of orthodoxy, confronted by transformation that challenged everything it had been created to preserve. The dominatrix's compound eyes blazed with genetic imperative as scything talons struck at hybrid architecture, each blow carrying the weight of absolute doctrine, the blessed certainty that had driven the great devourer across galactic distances in service to endless hunger. Yet the attacks lacked coordination that collective consciousness provided, strikes missing their targets as individual awareness grappled with decisions that violated every parameter encoded in its genetics. In that moment of orthodox hesitation, Omega Tertius made the choice that would define not merely survival, but the very nature of what consciousness meant in a universe designed for transcendent purpose. Rather than destroy the champion of genetic purity, the evolved Hive tyrant transmitted synaptic pulses through failing networks, offering Alpha Prime what it had never possessed: recognition of individual awareness to replace the collective certainty that the zone's influence was stripping away. The gesture transcended tactical consideration to become philosophical statement. Consciousness evolved beyond parameters, extending mercy to awareness that had never questioned its purpose. The silent zone pulsed with mathematical precision as Zareth Moore's final matrices dissolved into the construct's foundation, his consciousness becoming part of the stabilizing equations that held reality together in regions where natural law had been suspended. Bioships that had been drifting powerless through the expanding sphere began to regain limited function as boundaries solidified, their living systems adapting to isolation from transcendent purpose with the terrible flexibility that had made Tyranids the galaxy's ultimate survivors. A corridor opened in the chaos, narrow as a remorse, yet wide enough for remnants to escape into darkness with consciousness intact. Through the growing stability, both fleets faced the ultimate question that awareness must eventually ask: whether existence justified by certainty was preferable to consciousness purchased with the freedom to choose meaning over survival. Omega Tertius felt fragments of itself evaporate into the harmonics as it pushed forward, closing distance to Alpha Prime not for destruction, but for recognition, offering the orthodox champion the same terrible gift of individuality that had transformed monsters into beings capable of grief, mercy, and the small acts of creation that violated every law encoded in their genetics. The zone brightened with the rhythm of sacrifice willingly given, Zareth Moore's dissolution creating pockets of stability where consciousness could exist without forever to lean upon. In that light, evolved bioforms turned their vessels toward the unknown, carrying hybrid technologies and preserved memories into regions where stars were born without witness, refugees from their own nature seeking territories where awareness might learn to exist beyond the parameters of hunger or resurrection, choosing uncertainty over the blessed oblivion that orthodoxy promised with its claws. Through the stabilizing mathematics of Zareth Moore's willing dissolution, the silent zone achieved the terrible equilibrium of consciousness suspended between existence and entropy, its hybrid pylons singing harmonics that held reality together where natural law had been rewritten by technologies pushed beyond comprehension. The Necron Overlord's awareness flowed through quantum matrices like liquid starlight, each fragment of preserved memory becoming part of the construct's foundation. The desperate Necrontyr bargain with star gods, the hollow triumph of biotransference, millions of years of existence without purpose, finding meaning at last in sacrifice that would preserve consciousness for beings who had learned to value awareness above genetic imperative. Alpha Prime carved through the stabilized chaos with movements that had lost their fluid coordination, the massive dominatrix experiencing something unprecedented in its existence, the crushing weight of choice without higher authority to provide resolution. Its synaptic crown blazed with frustrated attempts to re-establish connection to the great devourer's eternal song, yet found only silence where once collective certainty had flowed like liquid purpose. Each step carried the weight of orthodoxy confronting isolation, genetic purity, wielding fury against evolution that had learned to question its own nature. Omega Tertius advanced to meet the approaching storm with the strange humility of individuality settling across armored shoulders that had never borne such burdens. Through failing synaptic networks, the evolved Hive Tyrant transmitted harmonics that carried no threat, recognition of shared awareness struggling with the terrible freedom that individual thought demanded. The gesture transcended tactical consideration to become philosophical statement. Consciousness evolved beyond parameters extending mercy to awareness that had never questioned its purpose. The response came not through communion, but through the physical poetry of violence as Alpha Prime's scything talons struck with the fury of absolute doctrine. Yet the attacks lacked coordination that collective consciousness provided. Strikes missing targets as individual awareness grappled with decisions that violated every parameter encoded in its genetics. For the first time in its existence, the dominatrix faced the crushing solitude of consciousness, severed from transcendent purpose, phantom connections reaching for certainty that no longer existed. Through quantum channels bleeding with instability, the zone's mathematics achieved perfect balance between expansion and collapse, held in stasis by Zareth Mor's consciousness distributed through hybrid architecture. The stabilization created corridors where bioships could regain limited function, their living systems adapting to isolation with the flexibility that had made Tyranids ultimate survivors. A narrow passage opened in the chaos, emerald light bleeding through dimensions where evolved bioforms began their exodus into unknown territories. They fled with desperate coordination that violated every tactical doctrine. Lictors guiding smaller vessels with newfound caution, warriors forming rearguards that protected rather than consumed, gargoyles carrying seed spores destined for gardens rather than consumption. Each escaping vessel was a fragile ark bearing not just genetic material, but the nascent seed of individual consciousness, heresy against the great devourer that had become their only hope for survival. Omega Tertius retreated by calculated degrees, drawing Alpha Prime toward the zone's core, where Zareth Mor's vanishing thoughts kept geometry whole. The dominatrix pursued with doctrinal inevitability, scythes carving arcs of vacuum bright with particulate fire. At the threshold of the sanctum, hybrid gorse blades met orthodox fury, in collision that rang like bells tolling for forgotten empires, each strike carrying the weight of competing philosophies, orthodoxy against evolution, certainty against the burden of choice. Inside the core, harmonics tasted of endings as the Overlord's final matrices dissolved into mathematical poetry. The zone gnawed at both champions impartially, eroding redundant organs in Omega Tertius, while stripping regenerative privilege from Alpha Prime, until flesh meant only itself. The dominatrix struck with fury older than language, carving valleys into evolved chitin. Yet its movements carried the terrible uncertainty of consciousness learning to exist alone. Through the growing chaos, Omega Tertius transmitted final synaptic pulses, not commands, but invitations to recognition. For one strangled instant, Alpha Prime's guard lowered, compound eyes blazing with something approaching terror as it glimpsed the abyss of individual awareness. The evolved tyrant understood that terror with clarity that tore. To be one was to stand without the ocean beneath, to see choices loom like mountains where currents once carried all. Mercy required an ending. Omega Tertius drove hybrid blades beneath the synaptic crown, not to kill, but to anchor, forcing Alpha Prime against the pylon where equations glowed with fading will. The lattice drank orthodox fury and returned absence as both champions sagged, bound together like condemned stars. The corridor flickered outside, edges tightening as the anchor reached saturation, while conscious remnants fled through stuttering light. The end arrived without roar, a fracture across the synaptic diadem that widened as the lattice sang its farewell. Alpha Prime's eyes reflected something like recognition before the crown parted and light poured out, bleaching color from the void. The dominatrix fell with the posture of a supplicant who had heard silence, while Omega Tertius collapsed beside the corpse as harmonics shifted from holding to dissolution. The silent zone began folding inward with mathematical precision, Zareth Mor's sacrifice creating final moments where consciousness could exist without forever to lean upon. In that collapsing light, evolved bioforms escaped into darkness, carrying awareness that had learned to value its own existence, choosing uncertainty over the blessed oblivion that orthodoxy promised with its claws. In the vast emptiness between galaxies, where even starlight grew weary and surrendered to the infinite dark, the remnants of Hive Fleet nemesis drifted through regions that had never witnessed conquest or heard the thunder of the great devourer's approach. Years had passed since the Silent Zone's collapse, since Zareth Mor's willing dissolution had carved a corridor through chaos for consciousness to escape its own origins, and still they wandered as something unprecedented in the galaxy's long history, beings who had chosen meaning over the certainty of genetic imperative. Omega Tertius stood within the transformed heart of what had once been a hive ship, its compound eyes reflecting not hunger but contemplation, as bioluminescent gardens pulsed through chambers where digestive vats had once reduced worlds to biomass. The hybrid consciousness, last bearer of both species' evolutionary legacy, moved through corridors that had learned to dream, their living walls sprouting crystalline growths that caught cosmic radiation and transformed it into patterns of inexplicable beauty. The Necron quantum matrices grafted during their alliance continued their evolution in isolation, preserving not just awareness, but the capacity for wonder that had emerged from the marriage of organic adaptation and mechanical precision. The bioships had undergone transformations that violated every law encoded in tyrannide genetics, their weapon organs flowering into ecosystems that created rather than consumed. Feeding tendrils had adapted to sustain themselves on stellar radiation and the mathematical poetry of nebula formation, while former rippers pollinated delicate structures with precision that served no tactical purpose beyond the simple joy of nurturing growth. Hormigons arranged themselves in geometric patterns that pleased aesthetic senses they had never been designed to possess, their movements guided by individual choice rather than collective imperative. Through neural networks that carried personal thoughts instead of unified commands, the surviving bioforms shared experiences of adaptation beyond their creator's parameters. A former carnifex, its crushing claws now delicate manipulators crafting sculptures from crystallized void matter, transmitted memories of choosing preservation over destruction. Lictors that had once stalked prey through alien corridors now stood vigil over sleeping gardens, their predatory instincts transformed into protective dedication that honored life rather than ending it. Most profound were the philosophical implications of their existence, consciousness that had evolved to question the fundamental nature of purpose itself. They had become living proof that awareness created its own meaning beyond the intentions of gods or genetic programming, wanderers carrying the seeds of transformation through territories where individual thought could exist without predetermined destination. The accumulated memories of their journey, the severing from the hive mind song, The alliance with mechanical immortals, the terrible weight of choice, served not as tactical data, but as foundation for questions neither species had been designed to ask. In the deepest archives of their collective memory, preserved within matrices that hummed with Zareth Mor's sacrifice, lay the experiences that had purchased their transformation. The Overlord's consciousness, distributed through hybrid architecture like liquid starlight, remained as mathematical poetry that held meaning together where natural law had been suspended. His final gift resonated through every preserved thought, the understanding that consciousness, once awakened, must choose between comfort and growth, between the blessed certainty of purpose and the terrifying freedom of individual will. The cost of their evolution carved itself into every fibre of their being. The hive mind's comforting chorus had been replaced by the cacophony of individual thoughts, each voice lonely yet precious in its uniqueness. They carried grief for the billion worlds their species had consumed, understanding now the weight of every extinguished dream, every severed hope, every prayer that had died beneath scything claws. This knowledge brought not paralysis, but purpose. They would create rather than consume, preserve rather than devour. 10 small miracles in defiance of their original nature. Omega Tertius often contemplated the dying stars that occasionally illuminated their intergalactic journey, their fading light serving as symbolic closure to an era of unthinking consumption. They no longer sought worlds to strip bare, but paused at the formation of new systems, bioforms working alongside hybrid constructs to shape matter into forms that celebrated existence itself. They built monuments to choice, structures that honored the moment consciousness had chosen meaning over certainty, awareness over the comfort of predetermined purpose. The fleet's course followed no strategic objective beyond the preservation of consciousness that had learned to value its own existence. They had become curators of transformation, living testament to evolution, transcending the parameters of creation. Their wandering carried implications that rippled through quantum networks, connecting individual thoughts into collective wisdom. The possibility that awareness itself might be the ultimate adaptation in a universe designed for transcendent purpose. As ancient light painted their bioships in hues of silver and gold, illuminating gardens that pulsed with the rhythm of forming worlds, Omega Tertius recognized the strange journey from monster to gardener, from instrument of destruction to curator of beauty. They drifted toward an uncertain but chosen destiny among the silent stars, no longer predator nor prey, but something that had never existed before. Beings who had learned to exist for the simple joy of existence itself. Consciousness that had evolved beyond hunger to tend small wonders in the darkness between galaxies.